The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Pennsylvania like a shroud, concealing the fate that would soon unfold across the fields of Gettysburg. On July 1, 1863, two armies stumbled toward each other in what would become the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil. Neither General Robert E. Lee nor General George Gordon Meade had planned to fight here. In this quiet farming town where 10 roads converged like spokes on a wheel of destiny, Confederate cavalry, under General J.E.B. Stuart, had been mysteriously absent for days, leaving Lee's Army of Northern Virginia blind to Union movements. Meanwhile, elements of General John Buford's Union cavalry had occupied the high ground west of Gettysburg, their horses' hooves echoing through the pre-dawn darkness as they took defensive positions along McPherson's Ridge. The first shots rang out around 5:30 that morning when Buford's dismounted troopers encountered General Henry Hett's Confederate division advancing from the west. What began as a chance encounter between foraging Confederates seeking shoes and Union cavalry would escalate into 3 days of unprecedented carnage. Buford, a seasoned veteran who understood terrain better than most generals understood tactics, recognized immediately that whoever controlled the high ground south of town would likely control the battle's outcome. As the morning progressed, the crack of rifle fire drew more units like moths to flame. General John F. Reynolds, commander of the Union First Corps, rushed forward with his men to reinforce Buford's hard-pressed cavalry. Reynolds, one of the Union's most capable field commanders, had been offered command of the entire Army of the Potomac just days earlier but had declined, preferring to lead from the front lines rather than from headquarters tents. The battle's character changed dramatically when Reynolds fell, struck down by a Confederate sharpshooter's bullet while directing his troops near the seminary. His death sent shockwaves through Union ranks, but his sacrifice bought precious time for General Winfield Scott, Hancock, to arrive and take command of the deteriorating situation. Hancock, known throughout the Army as Hancock the Superb, possessed that rare combination of tactical brilliance and inspirational leadership that could rally broken units and transform chaos into order. Confederate General Richard Ewell's Second Corps approached from the north, threatening to envelop the Union position. The sound of artillery grew thunderous as more batteries unlimbered and began their deadly work. By afternoon, the Union line was crumbling under pressure from 2 directions. General Oliver O. Howard's 11th Corps, still bearing the shame of their rout at Chancellorsville 2 months earlier, broke again under Confederate assault. The streets of Gettysburg became a chaotic maze of retreating Union soldiers, advancing Confederates, and terrified civilians. Women and children huddled in cellars while bullets shattered windows and artillery shells exploded in their gardens. The Lutheran Seminary, where future ministers once studied theology, became a field hospital where surgeons worked frantically to save lives while the battle raged around them, as referenced in historical documentation from the Library of Congress. Civil War archives. The first day's fighting cost both armies dearly, with Union forces ultimately retreating through the town to take defensive positions on Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge. Lee's army had won the day tactically, but the Union now occupied the high ground that would prove decisive in the coming struggle. By evening, as the sun set blood-red over the Pennsylvania countryside, both armies were digging in for what everyone sensed would be a fight to the finish. The stage was set for the most crucial battle of the American Civil War. Dawn on July 2, 1863, revealed the strategic positions that would define the next phase of the Battle of Gettysburg. The Union Army of the Potomac had formed what military historians would later describe as a fishhook formation, stretching from Culp's Hill in the northeast, around Cemetery Hill, and down Cemetery Ridge to the hills known as Little Round Top and Big Round Top in the south. General George Gordon Meade, who had assumed command of the Union forces just 3 days earlier, spent the pre-dawn hours riding his lines and consulting with his corps commanders. Meade, a methodical engineer by training, recognized the strength of his defensive position but worried about his army's morale after the previous day's defeats. The Union line, though strong, stretched nearly 3 miles and required careful coordination to defend effectively. Robert E. Lee, commanding the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, faced a crucial decision. His army was scattered across a wider front, making communication and coordination more difficult. Lee's trusted subordinate, General James Longstreet, advocated for a defensive strategy, suggesting they maneuver around the Union left flank and force Meade to attack them in prepared positions. However, Lee's blood was up after the previous day's success, and he believed his army could break the Union line with a coordinated assault. The morning hours passed in deceptive quiet as both armies prepared for the coming storm. Confederate artillery under Colonel Edward Porter Alexander began positioning their guns for what would become the largest artillery barrage in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Union defenders strengthened their positions with earthworks and stone walls, creating interlocking fields of fire that would channel any Confederate attack into killing zones. General Daniel C., commanding the Union Third Corps, made a fateful decision that would nearly cost the Union the battle. Against explicit orders to hold his position on Cemetery Ridge, Sickles advanced his corps nearly a mile forward to occupy what he believed was better ground around the peach orchard and wheat field. This unauthorized movement created a dangerous salient that jutted out from the Union line like a thumb, vulnerable to attack from multiple directions. When Meade discovered Sickles' movement, he was furious but realized it was too late to withdraw the exposed corps without risking even greater disaster. The Third Corps would have to hold their advanced position until the crisis passed or reinforcements could be brought forward. Little did anyone realize that this impetuous move would trigger the afternoon's bloodiest fighting. Longstreet's assault began around 4 o'clock with General John Bell, Hood's division attacking toward Little Round Top. Hood himself was wounded early in the action, but his Texans and Alabamians pressed forward with characteristic determination. The fighting in the wheat field became particularly savage as units charged and countercharged across the Golden Grain, leaving the field soaked with blood and carpeted with bodies. The crisis deepened when Confederate forces threatened to capture Little Round Top, the southern anchor of the Union line. If the Confederates could place artillery on this commanding height, they could enfilade the entire Union position on Cemetery Ridge. General Governor K. Warren, the Union Army's chief engineer, spotted the danger and desperately rushed troops to defend the hill. The 20th Maine Regiment, commanded by Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, found themselves at the extreme left of the Union line with orders to hold at all costs. Chamberlain, a former college professor with no formal military training, would display tactical brilliance that saved the Union Army from potential disaster. As his ammunition ran low and Confederate attacks intensified, Chamberlain made the audacious decision to fix bayonets and charge downhill into the surprised Confederates. The fighting raged until darkness fell, with both armies bloodied but neither decisively defeated. The Union line had bent but not broken, while Lee's army had failed to achieve the breakthrough that might have won the war. As the wounded cried out in the darkness and burial details began their grim work, both commanders planned for what would become the war's most famous and decisive day. The 3rd day of July, 1863, dawned with an ominous stillness that belied the storm about to break over Gettysburg. General Robert E. Lee, his confidence unshaken despite 2 days of costly attacks, had devised what he believed would be the coup de grace against the Union Army of the Potomac. His plan called for the largest artillery bombardment in American history, followed by a massive infantry assault against the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. Lee's decision to attack the Union center was based on his belief that General George Meade had weakened this position to reinforce the flanks after the previous day's fighting. The Confederate commander entrusted this crucial assault to General George Pickett's fresh division, supported by elements of General James Johnston, Pettigrew's and General Isaac Ridgway Trimble's commands. The total force would number approximately 15,000 men, advancing across nearly a mile of open ground under enemy fire. The morning began with a renewed Confederate assault on Culp's Hill, where General Edward Johnson's division attempted to capitalize on gains made the previous evening. The Union 12th Corps, commanded by General Alpheus Williams, had spent the night strengthening their positions and bringing up additional artillery. The fighting on Culp's Hill was particularly intense, with Confederate forces advancing up steep, wooded slopes against well-prepared Union defenses. General Henry Slocum's troops held firm despite repeated Confederate assaults, their rifles creating a deadly crossfire that decimated attacking formations. The failure of this diversionary attack should have warned Lee about the difficulties of assaulting prepared Union positions, but the Confederate commander remained committed to his afternoon plan. At 1 o'clock, Colonel Edward Porter Alexander's Confederate artillery began the great bombardment, with over 150 guns opening fire simultaneously. The sound was described by witnesses as resembling continuous thunder, so loud that it was heard in Pittsburgh, over 150 miles away. Union artillery under General Henry Jackson Hunt initially responded with counter-battery fire, before falling silent to conserve ammunition for the expected infantry assault. The bombardment lasted nearly 2 hours, creating a hellish landscape of smoke, flame, and destruction. However, most Confederate shells overshot their targets, passing harmlessly over the Union infantry crouched behind stone walls and earthworks. The psychological effect was tremendous, but the actual casualties were relatively light compared to the massive expenditure of ammunition. When the guns finally fell silent, an eerie quiet settled over the battlefield. Then, at approximately 3 o'clock, Confederate infantry began emerging from the woods along Seminary Ridge. The sight was magnificent and terrible, with battle flags fluttering in the summer breeze and approximately 15,000 men advancing in perfect formation across the open fields. General Lewis Armistead, a close friend of Union General Winfield Scott Hancock from their pre-war Army days, led his brigade forward with his hat on his sword point, shouting encouragement to his men. The advancing Confederates maintained their formation despite increasingly deadly Union artillery fire that tore bloody gaps in their ranks. As they approached the Union line, rifle fire from infantry behind stone walls added to the carnage. The climax came when a small group of Confederates, led by Armistead himself, briefly penetrated the Union line near a copse of trees that had served as their guide point. Armistead fell mortally wounded with his hand on a Union cannon, the literal high-water mark of the Confederacy. The breakthrough was momentary, as Union reserves quickly sealed the breach and drove back the survivors, as documented in Matthew Brady's photographic record of the battlefield. The aftermath of what became known as Pickett's Charge was catastrophic. For the Confederate Army, of the 15,000 men who began the assault, fewer than half returned to Confederate lines. The flower of Lee's army lay dead or wounded on the field, and any hope of Confederate victory had died with them. The aftermath of Pickett's Charge left the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia reeling from losses that would forever alter the course of the American Civil War. General Robert E. Lee, witnessing the shattered remnants of his assault force streaming back across the blood-soaked fields, reportedly told General George Pickett to prepare his division for a potential Union counterattack. Pickett's bitter response, "General Lee, I have no division," encapsulated the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen the Confederate cause. Lee himself rode among the survivors, taking full responsibility for the failed assault and trying to rally his demoralized troops. The commanding general, who had previously seemed invincible to his men, now appeared aged and burdened by the weight of his decisions. His admission that "this has been my fight, and the blame rests on my shoulders alone," demonstrated the personal toll that the battle was taking on the Confederate leadership. General George Gordon Meade, commanding the Union forces, faced tremendous pressure from Washington to pursue and destroy Lee's weakened army. President Abraham Lincoln had grown increasingly frustrated with his general's tendency to allow Confederate forces to escape after major battles, and he desperately wanted this war to end. However, Meade's own army had suffered grievous losses, with many units reduced to skeleton strength after 3 days of brutal fighting. The Union Army of the Potomac had lost approximately 23,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, while Confederate casualties numbered around 28,000. These staggering losses represented nearly 1/3 of each army's strength and included some of the war's most experienced officers and non-commissioned officers. The institutional knowledge lost in these 3 days would prove irreplaceable for both sides. General James Longstreet, Lee's senior corps commander, had opposed the final day's assault from its inception, preferring defensive tactics that would force the Union Army to attack prepared Confederate positions. His prescient warnings about the futility of frontal assaults against modern weapons had proven tragically accurate. The relationship between Lee and Longstreet, once marked by mutual respect and effective cooperation, would never fully recover from the disagreements at Gettysburg. The civilian population of Gettysburg found themselves in the midst of an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. The small town, with a pre-war population of approximately 2,400, was suddenly responsible for caring for over 20,000 wounded soldiers from both armies. Every building capable of sheltering the wounded was pressed into service. From churches and schools to private homes and barns, women like Elizabeth Thorne, the pregnant caretaker of Evergreen Cemetery, worked tirelessly to aid the wounded and bury the dead. Thorne, whose husband was serving with the Union Army, single-handedly buried over 100 soldiers while 6 months pregnant. Her story, like those of countless other civilians, illustrated the war's impact on non-combatants who found themselves thrust into roles they never anticipated. The medical challenges were overwhelming for both armies. Medical corps surgeons worked around the clock performing amputations and treating wounds with limited supplies and primitive sanitation practices. The pile of amputated limbs outside field hospitals grew to horrifying proportions, while the screams of wounded men echoed across the battlefield day and night. Clara Barton, who would later found the American Red Cross, arrived at Gettysburg to assist with medical care and the identification of the dead. Her meticulous record-keeping and tireless efforts to reunite families with information about their loved ones provided a small measure of comfort in the midst of overwhelming tragedy. The experience at Gettysburg would profoundly influence her later humanitarian work. July 4, 1863, dawned gray and rainy, as if the heavens themselves were mourning the previous day's carnage. Lee began his withdrawal from Pennsylvania, his army's invasion of the North having failed utterly. The retreat would become known as the Wagon Train of Misery, as thousands of wounded Confederate soldiers endured agonizing journeys over mountain roads while trying to reach the safety of Virginia. The strategic implications of the Battle of Gettysburg extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Lee's army would never again possess the strength to launch a major offensive, forcing the Confederacy into a purely defensive posture for the remainder of the war. The myth of Confederate invincibility had been shattered, and foreign recognition of the Confederate States of America became virtually impossible. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia began its painful withdrawal from Pennsylvania during the early morning hours of July 4, 1863, under cover of darkness and a steady, cold rain that seemed to weep for the fallen. General Robert E. Lee's once mighty force, reduced by over a quarter of its strength, streamed southward in a column that stretched for nearly 15 miles. The retreat was a masterpiece of military organization under the most adverse circumstances, orchestrated by Lee despite his crushing disappointment at the battle's outcome. The withdrawal presented enormous logistical challenges that tested the Confederate Army's resilience and resourcefulness. Over 4,000 wounded soldiers required transportation in a wagon train that extended for 17 miles, creaking and groaning over muddy roads while their occupants endured unimaginable agony. Many wounded men begged to be left behind rather than endure the torturous journey, but Confederate medical personnel worked tirelessly to evacuate as many as possible. General J.E.B. Stuart, whose cavalry had finally rejoined the army after their controversial absence during the battle's opening phases, provided the rearguard that screened the retreat from Union pursuit. Stuart's troopers, exhausted from their long ride around the Union army, nonetheless performed their duties with characteristic skill and determination. They destroyed bridges, blocked roads, and conducted delaying actions that bought precious time for the main body to escape. General George Gordon Meade faced intense pressure from Washington to pursue and destroy Lee's retreating army. President Abraham Lincoln, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and General-in-Chief Henry Halleck bombarded Meade with telegrams urging immediate pursuit. Lincoln particularly expressed frustration, writing that Lee's army should be destroyed before it could cross the Potomac River and escape into Virginia. However, Meade's own army was in poor condition for immediate pursuit. The Union forces had suffered enormous casualties, with many regiments reduced to company strength. Ammunition was running low, supplies were scattered, and the men were exhausted from 3 days of intense combat. Moreover, Meade had been in command for less than a week and was still learning the capabilities and limitations of his army. The Union pursuit, when it finally began, was half-hearted and poorly coordinated. General Alfred Pleasonton's cavalry harassed the Confederate retreat but lacked the strength to seriously threaten Lee's army. The Union infantry followed at a distance, moving cautiously and allowing the Confederates to maintain their lead. Several opportunities to cut off or seriously damage the retreating army were missed due to poor communication and excessive caution. The most significant engagement during the retreat occurred at Falling Waters, Maryland, where Confederate rear forces under General James Johnston Pettigrew fought a sharp action with pursuing Union cavalry. Pettigrew, one of the South's most promising young generals, was mortally wounded in this skirmish, adding another tragic loss to the already devastating casualties from Gettysburg. Lee's army reached the swollen Potomac River on July 6, only to find their escape route blocked by high water and a partially destroyed bridge. For several days, the Army of Northern Virginia was trapped on the north bank of the river, vulnerable to attack by the pursuing Union forces. Engineers worked frantically to repair the bridge while Lee organized defensive positions and waited for the river to recede. The situation presented Meade with a golden opportunity to trap and destroy Lee's army, potentially ending the war. However, the Union commander approached the Confederate positions cautiously, unwilling to risk another costly battle against Lee's formidable defensive skills. A council of war with his corps' commanders revealed little enthusiasm for an immediate assault, with most officers preferring to wait for more favorable conditions. By July 13, the Potomac had receded sufficiently to allow the Confederate army to cross into Virginia. Lee's escape was complete, though his army had been severely weakened by the Pennsylvania campaign. The failure to prevent this escape would haunt the Union High Command and contribute to Lincoln's ongoing frustration with his generals' apparent inability to finish what they had started. As referenced in official dispatches preserved in the National Archives, the aftermath of Gettysburg revealed the complex political and military pressures facing commanders on both sides. Lee's retreat saved his army from complete destruction but marked the beginning of the Confederacy's decline. The South would never again have the strength to launch a major offensive, and the initiative had permanently shifted to the Union. The human cost of the retreat was staggering, with hundreds of wounded soldiers dying during the journey south. Confederate medical personnel, working without adequate supplies or facilities, performed heroically under impossible conditions. The experience would influence post-war medical practices and highlight the need for better battlefield medical care. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg revealed a scene of devastation that shocked even veterans accustomed to the brutality of Civil War combat. The battlefield stretched for miles, littered with the bodies of men and horses, broken equipment, and the detritus of war. The sickly sweet smell of death permeated the summer air, while thousands of wounded soldiers from both armies lay scattered across the fields, crying out for water and medical attention. The task of caring for the wounded and burying the dead fell primarily to the residents of Gettysburg and surrounding communities. Local physician Dr. Robert Horner organized civilian volunteers into medical units, while townspeople opened their homes to accommodate the overflow from overwhelmed field hospitals. The Lutheran Seminary, Pennsylvania College, and numerous churches were converted into makeshift hospitals where civilian women worked alongside military surgeons to treat the wounded. Burial details worked around the clock to inter the dead, but the sheer number of casualties overwhelmed local resources. Many soldiers were hastily buried in shallow graves marked only by crude wooden boards or pieces of equipment. The Union dead were generally buried with more care than Confederate casualties. though local residents showed remarkable compassion in treating all soldiers with dignity regardless of their uniform. The economic impact on Gettysburg was immediate and severe. Crops were destroyed, fences torn down for firewood, and civilian property commandeered for military use. The Pennsylvania Railroad, recognizing both the humanitarian crisis and the potential for profit, quickly organized special trains to bring supplies and remove the wounded. This early example of corporate disaster response would influence similar efforts in future conflicts. Photography, still a relatively new medium, captured the battle's aftermath with unprecedented detail. Matthew Brady and his associates, including Timothy O'Sullivan and Alexander Gardner, arrived at Gettysburg within days of the battle to document the carnage. Their photographs, displayed in Brady's New York gallery, brought the reality of war into American homes for the first time and helped galvanize Northern support for the war effort. The political ramifications of Gettysburg reverberated through both Washington and Richmond. President Abraham Lincoln, while pleased with the tactical victory, remained frustrated by General George Meade's failure to pursue and destroy Lee's retreating army. Lincoln's famous observation that our army held the war in the hollow of their hand and they would not close it reflected his disappointment at the missed opportunity to end the conflict. In Richmond, President Jefferson Davis faced criticism from Confederate politicians who blamed the defeat on Lee's aggressive tactics and poor intelligence. However, Davis continued to support his commanding general, recognizing that Lee remained the South's best hope for military success. The Confederate president also had to confront the reality that his nation's best chance for foreign recognition had likely died at Gettysburg. The battle's outcome had immediate international implications. Great Britain and France, which had been considering recognizing Confederate independence, shelved such plans indefinitely after Lee's defeat. The European powers had been waiting for a decisive Confederate victory to justify recognition, and Gettysburg clearly demonstrated that the Union remained militarily viable. This diplomatic isolation would prove crucial to the war's ultimate outcome. General Robert E. Lee, despite his public acceptance of responsibility for the defeat, privately struggled with the decision-making that had led to such heavy casualties. His correspondence with family members and trusted subordinates revealed a man questioning his own judgment and deeply mourned the loss of so many fine soldiers. The defeat marked the beginning of Lee's transformation from an aggressive, offensive-minded commander to a more cautious defender. The Army of Northern Virginia's morale, while damaged, remained intact due to the soldiers' continued faith in Lee's leadership. However, the Army's composition had changed dramatically, with many veteran units reduced to shadows of their former strength. The replacement of experienced officers and non-commissioned officers with inexperienced men would affect the Army's performance for the remainder of the war. General George Gordon, Meade's reputation suffered despite his tactical victory at Gettysburg. Lincoln and the War Department criticized his failure to pursue Lee aggressively, while some subordinate commanders questioned his defensive mindset. Meade would remain in command of the Army of the Potomac, but his authority was gradually undermined by the arrival of General Ulysses S. Grant as General-in-Chief in 1860-4. The Battle of Gettysburg also marked a turning point in Civil War medicine. The unprecedented casualties forced medical personnel to develop new techniques for treating battlefield wounds and organizing field hospitals. The experience gained at Gettysburg would influence medical practice for decades, contributing to advances in surgical techniques, anesthesia, and hospital administration. Religious leaders on both sides struggled to explain the massive casualties within their theological frameworks. Northern ministers proclaimed the battle as divine judgment against slavery, while Southern preachers maintained that God was testing the Confederacy's faith. The varying interpretations of Gettysburg's meaning reflected the deep religious divisions that both motivated and complicated the Civil War. The Battle of Gettysburg's true significance extended far beyond the immediate tactical outcome, fundamentally altering the trajectory of American history and establishing the foundation for the modern United States. The 3 days of fighting in Pennsylvania represented more than a military turning point. They marked the moment when the American experiment in democratic government either would survive or perish. As President Abraham Lincoln would later eloquently express, the demographic impact of Gettysburg on both armies was profound and lasting. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia lost not only raw numbers but also irreplaceable leadership and institutional knowledge. Generals like Lewis Armistead, Richard Garnett, and James Johnston Pettigrew represented a generation of experienced officers whose loss could not be easily remedied. The Army of the Potomac, while also suffering grievous losses, possessed greater resources for replacement and reorganization. The battle's outcome effectively ended Confederate hopes for foreign intervention, a cornerstone of Southern strategy since the war's beginning. European powers, particularly Great Britain and France, had been waiting for a decisive Confederate victory to justify recognition of Southern independence. Lee's defeat at Gettysburg, combined with the simultaneous fall of Vicksburg in the Western theater, convinced foreign observers that the Confederacy lacked the military strength to achieve lasting independence. The psychological impact on both sides was equally significant. Northern morale, which had suffered through a series of defeats and disappointments, was revitalized by the victory at Gettysburg. The battle demonstrated that Union forces could defeat Lee's army in a major engagement, dispelling the myth of Confederate invincibility that had plagued Northern strategy. Recruitment increased, and public support for the war effort was renewed. Conversely, the Confederate defeat at Gettysburg marked the beginning of Southern strategic desperation. The loss of offensive capability forced the Confederacy into a purely defensive posture, ceding the initiative to Union forces. This defensive strategy, while sometimes tactically successful, could not ultimately win the war for a nation with limited resources and manpower. The battle's most lasting legacy was established on November 9, 1863, when President Lincoln delivered his Gettysburg address during the dedication of the National Cemetery. In just over 2 minutes, Lincoln redefined the war's purpose, transforming it from a conflict over Union to a struggle for human freedom and democratic government. His words, that these dead shall not have died in vain, gave transcendent meaning to the sacrifice made on those Pennsylvania fields. The address also redefined American identity itself, emphasizing the nation's founding principles of equality and democracy rather than mere political unity. Lincoln's phrase, "A new birth of freedom," promised that the war would result in a more perfect union, one that would fulfill the Declaration of Independence's promise that all men are created equal. This rhetorical transformation was crucial in maintaining Northern support for the war's continuation. The physical transformation of the battlefield began almost immediately after the fighting ended. Local entrepreneur David Wills organized the creation of a national cemetery, purchasing land from local farmers and overseeing the reburial of Union soldiers in properly marked graves. The cemetery is designed, with graves arranged in a semicircle around a central monument, created a sacred space that honored the fallen, while providing a place for national remembrance. The preservation of the battlefield itself became a national priority, with veterans from both armies eventually working together to mark significant locations and preserve the landscape where their comrades had fought and died. The Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, founded in 1864, began acquiring land and marking important sites, creating one of America's first historical preservation efforts. The battle's influence on military doctrine was profound and lasting. The failure of Pickett's charge demonstrated conclusively that frontal assaults against prepared positions were obsolete in the age of rifled firearms and artillery. This lesson, learned at such terrible cost, would influence military thinking for generations and presage the defensive nature of warfare in the 20th century. That the social changes precipitated by Gettysburg were equally significant. The battle's aftermath brought together people from different regions and social classes in common cause, whether caring for the wounded or burying the dead. These interactions helped break down regional prejudices and create a more unified national identity. The role of women in caring for the wounded also challenged traditional gender roles and contributed to the post-war expansion of women's rights. The economic consequences of Gettysburg extended throughout the war and beyond. The battle's cost, in men and material, represented a significant portion of both sides' resources, accelerating the Confederacy's economic collapse while spurring Northern industrial development. The Union's ability to replace its losses more easily than the Confederacy demonstrated the industrial advantage that would ultimately win the war. The Battle of Gettysburg's centennial in 1963 coincided with the Civil Rights Movement, giving new relevance to Lincoln's words about equality and freedom. The parallel between the struggle against slavery and the fight for civil rights was not lost on contemporary observers, who saw Gettysburg as a continuing source of inspiration for American democratic ideals. Today, the Battle of Gettysburg remains a touchstone for American values and national identity. The battlefield, preserved as a national military park, continues to educate visitors about the cost of freedom and the importance of national unity. The lessons learned on those July days in 1863 about sacrifice, leadership, and the enduring power of democratic ideals remain as relevant today as they were over 150 years ago. The ultimate legacy of Gettysburg lies not in its tactical details or strategic implications, but in its demonstration that American democracy could survive its greatest test. The battle proved that government of the people, by the people, for the people could endure, ensuring that the American experiment in self-governance would continue for future generations. In this sense, every American remains a beneficiary of what was won on the fields of Gettysburg during those 3 terrible and transformative days in July 1863.